Good evening. Good evening, everyone. It's a privilege, it's a real honor, it's a joy to be with you here and to be a part of this reboot of our major speaker series here at Christendom. I've been a major disappointment lots of times in my life, but I've never been a major speaker. So this is a new experience for me. I'm going to do my best not to make it yet another instance of major disappointment. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I'm not giving a lecture tonight. Okay, I take that back. I'm giving a very, very, very short lecture tonight. I want to give an initial reply to our central question tonight. What is art and why does it matter? But think of it more as an hors d'oeuvre tray. Don't think of it as the feast of reason and flow of soul that I hope will follow in the Q&A that I will enjoy with Dr. Harne afterward. So most of the evening is conversation. And Dr. Harne and I will talk for a while, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. And I invite you all to join in the conversation. And that's the sweet stuff. That's what we're really here for. That's what I'm looking forward to. But first, the hors d'oeuvre tray. I want to show you some really weird pictures. I'm talking about strange stuff, ladies and gentlemen. Look at these people. They're in an air-conditioned building, looking at artifacts hanging on a wall with images on them of themselves. Now, they may not literally be pictures of these particular people, but they are images of human beings. So we can say they're looking at pictures of themselves. Here's what's weirder. Then they're going to go down to the gift shop, and they're going to buy coffee mugs and tote bags and T-shirts with pictures on them of the pictures. The aardvarks don't do that, as far as I am aware. Sometimes we like our pictures to be three-dimensional. So we make them sometimes even very lifelike, like Queen Nefertiti here. And they're 3D so that we can move around them, just as we do a real human being. Sometimes we like our pictures to be living, moving, breathing, sweating in front of us. Here's Ralph Fiennes playing Macbeth recently. And if you have a ticket in the front row, you might even catch some of his spittle as he recites Shakespeare for 3 hours straight. But what are we doing when we sit in the theater? But again, watching a kind of picture of ourselves. Here's even weirder. Sometimes we'll sit in the dark in a public place with total strangers after buying popcorn at exorbitant prices, and we'll watch pictures again, moving pictures on a screen of human beings. Now, I grant you, sometimes the pictures don't even depict a real world. Sometimes they even depict wholly imaginary characters. March 25th, tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen, yes, most importantly, it's the solemnity of the Annunciation. It's also the day we celebrate Frodo throwing the ring into Mount Doom. But even in looking at pictures of Middle-earth, I claim we're still looking at pictures of ourselves. Sometimes we even bring the flat screen into our homes so we can enjoy it with our family in a more intimate setting. Sometimes we put our pictures into language without literal pictures, just language, so that the pictures of ourselves are formed in our imaginations, in poetry, in novels, in short stories. And we climb into bed and we enjoy these pictures before we go to sleep. Amazing. Sometimes We're so excited to picture ourselves that we break out into song. And we even invent instruments that sometimes even mimic the human voice or create a rhythm so we can even begin to dance to our picturing. And sometimes the dance doesn't have instrumentation, but it has a choreography attached to it. But again, I claim a picture of ourselves. Sometimes the picturing becomes more abstract, more symbolic. Sometimes it becomes sheer sound. No lyrics, no story attached. So we're not talking about a ballet, we're not talking about an opera, we're not talking about a Broadway musical. It's just structured sound. But yet another way in which we can look at ourselves. Now, what I'm trying to do here this evening, of course, is to defamiliarize you with the activity that you do pretty much every day of your lives, and that is appreciate works of art. I want you tonight to look at art with fresh eyes. I want you to see it, in a way, as a kind of strange activity that we human beings do. Let me attack that first question. What is art? Let's start with what is most obvious. It is a delightful sensory experience. Wouldn't you agree? If it's nothing else, it's that. Keep in mind, in our tradition, a sensory experience involves not just our five exterior senses, but also our interior senses. And one of the most important of our interior senses is our imagination. So if a work of art is going to be anything, it's going to be this feast for the senses. But of course, that is not all. Art is much more than that. Art also offers us a look at the meaning of human existence. It offers some take on what makes human life intelligible. To use a little bit more of a technical philosopher's term, what art does through the sensory experience is offer us the substantial form of human life. And what is the form of human life? The form of human life, Tolkien taught us this, is that of quest. And what are we questing for as human beings? We're questing for fulfillment. We're questing for total and complete satisfaction. We're questing for that thing that Aristotle calls eudaimonia, and we most often translate as happiness. So here's what art is. Art is a rich sensory experience that does the trick at the same time of offering us something of the meaning of the human adventure, of the human experience in questing for happiness. In other words, art is a contemplative delight. It's a feast for our minds, but not just for our minds. It's a feast for those senses. It's also a feast for our will. It involves our whole being. And it attracts our whole being as embodied spirits. It is the perfect match for an embodied spirit because it has the sensory element that suits our animal nature, and it has the intelligible element that suits our rational nature. And as I like to tell my students, that sandwich is just irresistible for us as human beings. Right? At one and the same time, the sensible, the intelligible together. Wow. Now, we get contemplative delight, not just in our enjoyment of art, but in many occasions in our life. But too often it's piecemeal, it's catch as catch can, it's here and there. What the artist offers us is an experience of contemplative delight that is especially intense. And I like to compare it to my enjoyment of these core power drinks. You drink one of these, you get 26 grams of protein, right? It's a heavy-duty, intense shot, right? That's kind of what the work of art is offering you, right? Yes, you can contemplate the human adventure in lots of different ways in human life, but the artist says, come with me, I've made this special concoction. I call it a play, I call it a poem, I call it a novel, I call it a movie. Drink this concoction, and you will have an intense experience of contemplative delight that is just not impossible, but very rare in our everyday lives. What is the point of art? Why does it matter? It was St. Bernard of Clairvaux who said, "What we love, we shall come to resemble. What we love, we shall come to resemble." The contemplative delight that we enjoy in a work of art is an attraction. It's a captivation for us. We are beguiled by works of art. Again, they attract our minds, but not just our minds. All of our senses and our sense appetites, and also our rational appetite, the will. And when we love something, we are apt to conform ourselves to it. We are apt to become as much as we can like the beloved, so we can change. So art matters, art is important because it can change an individual life. It can change an entire culture. It's not automatic. It's not strict cause and effect. It's not like Ebenezer Scrooge's experience in A Christmas Carol. It doesn't happen overnight. But yet, great art, at any rate, has a very subtle, very mysterious influence over us. And over time, if we experience it enough, we will begin to conform to it, most likely. So it's absolutely essential for an individual and a culture to be immersed in great art, and I would contend particularly by stories. We know ourselves and we understand the meaning of our lives, most of all through stories. So I'll end my remarks by quoting the novelist and philosopher Iris Murdoch, who once said, "Man is the animal who makes pictures of himself and then comes to resemble the picture." That's what art is about. We make pictures of ourselves to contemplate what it means to be a human being. And we are at least apt then to come to resemble the picture. That's a very general overview, but I look forward to elaborating upon it in my discussion now with Dr. Harne. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. McInerny. I want to invite to the stage Dr. Harne to take some questions, to ask some questions, that is, of Dr. McInerny, and to have a conversation. While they're talking, do be thinking of questions that you yourself want to ask. We'll let them talk for a bit, and if you have a question, we can line up in the middle here, and I'll take the questions in order.
That's what I know.
Don't begin lining up, please, until I walk to the middle aisle, and when you see me there, then go ahead and line up and be ready with your question to ask.
I thought it would be a nice backdrop to our conversation. This is the writing desk of Flannery O'Connor, It was in her bedroom in her home in Milledgeville, Georgia. She both slept and worked in the room she lived in because she was ill from lupus in the last 13 years of her life. And just tomorrow, again, big day tomorrow, other than being the solemnity of the Annunciation, it's also Flannery O'Connor's 100th birthday. She was born on March 25, 2025. So,
wow. That's great. Big day tomorrow.
Big day tomorrow.
Well, thank you for this overview, and thank you for
Thank you.
the presentation. And thank you for writing this book. I think we both have copies here tonight. So I think the plan is that I'll ask some questions to sort of prime the pump, and we'll get things going.
Good.
I think you and I could probably sit and talk for a long time about these things. So I'm
That
going
would
to try
be
to
fun.
maintain a level of restraint here and ask a few questions.
Yes.
And then we'll open it up. And I think there were questions probably, I hope, from the faculty. I know there were some discussions before even this event took place about maybe someone should ask him this or someone should ask him that. So I know there are questions out there. But we definitely want questions from the students. So there's a lot to discuss. I brought along some of the things I've come across recently that have raised questions for me. Father Pollard had mentioned a passage in C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce about art, which I reread on an airplane recently. So I've got a question there. And then there was an article in First Things about James Macmillan, the composer.
Oh, yes.
Which raised some questions that I wanted to bring to your attention.
Fantastic.
Maybe we could begin with a bit of an autobiographical note. Obviously, you invested a great deal of time and energy into writing this book. Could you say a bit about the role of art in your life personally? I suspect that there have been moments where art has perhaps changed the way you see things or changed the course of things in your own life. You obviously came to write this book. Could you say a bit about art in your own way of interacting in the world, in your own history?
Thank you. I don't mind saying that I consider myself an artist before a philosopher. That was certainly my experience growing up. Kind of my sense of self, even as a very small kid, was at an artist. Probably like a lot of you here. I spent a lot of my childhood drawing cartoons. I was going to be an animator for Walt Disney. Then I fell in with a bad crowd and got a Ph.D. in philosophy. Philosophy came much later. It was really only in maybe my junior year of college that I took some courses that opened my eyes to this kind of reflection. One of them was a course on the philosophy of art. And then I began to think, as I was getting ready to graduate and thinking about how I might feed myself in the future, that maybe a career as an academic philosopher might not be a bad idea. I had a model of that in-house, as Dr. Tracy said, so that was easy to imagine, and it was also very easy to imagine being an academic philosopher and continuing to be an artist, because my father modeled that as well, being both philosopher and novelist. So I knew it was possible to do both and not choose. But I still think it's fair to say that I approach things, first of all, artistically, though it's been infiltrated by a lot of theory at this point. But I feel perhaps most comfortable being artistic. Being philosophical is the more learned activity, I might say. But I find the two go together well, though there are times when you need to keep them quite separate and let, as it were, the right hemisphere mode of your thinking be creative and not be too analytical and overthought. So that's a beginning of a portrait of the artist as an older man.
Well, so you mentioned Walt Disney and animation. I mean, were you attracted to drawing and the visual?
Yes, absolutely.
Prior to the verbal?
Yes, and I think that comes first, even for a lot of people who end up writing poetry or fiction or whatever, happened with Flannery O'Connor. She was a wonderful cartoonist, and she cartooned for her college newspaper. I think she stopped when she went to graduate school at the Iowa Writers Workshop, but you can see a connection between her cartoons. They're grotesques.
Right.
And then when you see that the characters of her fiction, as she herself called them grotesque, you see a very clear line between the two. So there may be a connection that's fun to explore between drawing of any kind. I don't know if it has to be cartooning, but the visual arts leading into the verbal arts needn't work that way, but it often does.
Yeah, and you mentioned Tolkien earlier, and you think about all of his illustrations.
Oh, he was marvelous. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was he was no dabbler when it came not just to drawing but to painting. He was a watercolorist of a very high order, I think.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting. You sort of start off your narrative sort of from the craft side, as someone who likes to make things.
Yes.
I think for others, it's an experience of something that already exists. They encounter something beautiful. They encounter a painting or an image or a work of art. Did you have any of those moments, or was it primarily from the making side?
No, I think my father, being a professor, enjoyed sabbatical years, and he liked to take them in Europe, as professors do. And so I spent 2 years of my childhood growing up in Europe, in Italy. They were non-consecutive years, because 7 years apart, them being sabbatical years. So I was a kindergartner at a British Montessori school in Rome. And then later on, I was an 8th grader at a Catholic high school run by the Holy Cross Brothers. Okay. When I was 4 or 5 years old, I vividly remember my parents taking me to a modern art exhibit in Rome and seeing works of Paul Klee, which are very abstract sorts of works. But I remember just being fascinated by those. Again, maybe the weirdness of the shapes. But that really captivated me. And I think just generally being taken to museums, being in an environment like Rome so early, made the experience with beauty it came very naturally.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I want to go back to Paul Klee at some point, ask you about Paul Klee. But first I want to bring in, beauty has been lingering off stage, and I want to bring beauty in and ask a bit about that. How do you coordinate in your mind and you're thinking about the relationship between beauty and art? Because how do you bring those together?
I think it's worth saying, first of all, that beauty is not just about art. It transcends art. There's quibbles about this among Thomistic thinkers, but I tend to think that beauty is a transcendental property of being, which is to say, beauty is woven into the very fabric of reality, as is truth and goodness. So it's, in one sense, it's everywhere. Certainly not just in works of art. So I think that's good to say. But the beautiful will manifest itself. That's part of the point of the core power example, is that beauty will manifest itself not only in art, but it can, with a special intensity, a special concentration, manifest itself in a great work of art. It can do that on a hike in a beautiful day in the Shenandoah. Right. It can do that looking into the eyes of a baby. You can have that experience. But what the artist does is he crafts that experience of contemplative delight with such deliberation and care. He's really preparing us for that experience of the beautiful that I think we often find it there and are very happy to find it there, maybe most of all. Yeah. Hard to say.
Yeah. Well, and it also makes me think, this is different from Paul Klee, but I'm thinking of Picasso's Guernica, which is an example of art, but it's not meant to be beautiful in the most conventional way.
in the most conventional
It's
way.
doing something else.
Yes.
How do you coordinate these things that might stretch our understanding of what beauty is in relation to art? Or
Part-
make demands that all art has to be beautiful in an immediately accessible way?
A big part of the problem is all the associations we have with the English word beauty, which have to do with it being pretty, inviting, comfortable, soothing even. There's nothing in, say, Thomas Aquinas' discussion of beauty or the few things that Aristotle has to say about beauty that say anything about such things. I have no problem myself calling Picasso's Guernica beautiful, but it will strike our ears as strange because it's a horrific image of warfare, right, and of the killing of innocents. But I would say the beautiful does radiate through that. And in what sense? What am I talking about? Well, maybe return to my opening remarks. It's bringing intelligibility, meaning, even into that horrific situation. Not trying to say, of course, that it's not horrific,
right,
but it's trying to show us the reality of the horror.
Okay.
And that's a kind of meaning that we should grasp. And that's a big part of the beautiful.
It reminds me of Benedict XVI's discussion about the sort of the witnesses to the truth of Christianity, you know, the lives of the saints and the great art.
Yes.
And I remember my first time I read that and discussed that text with students, you know, over on the wall in the classroom was a crucifix.
Yeah.
The idea that the crucifix could be in some sense conceived of as understood as beautiful.
Yes.
This is a man being executed on
Yes. Gruesomely.
In what sense is this even beautiful?
Gruesomely.
But it stretches.
I think my colleagues can help me. I think it was St. Thomas Aquinas who said that Christ on the cross is the most beautiful thing in the world. We have taken our discussion from the philosophical plane up into the supernatural plane, and that's a good place to go. But now we have to start thinking about the intelligibility of spiritual things, which do not depend so much on the sensory delight.
Right.
So there's no sensory delight in any conventional sense in contemplating Christ on the cross or the crucifixion itself. But the intelligibility of that salvific act is there's nothing more meaningful for human existence. And so it's maximally beautiful, I would say.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe you could speak to this question, and I'll put it in a rather bald form, which would be, why is so much Catholic art so bad? Why is so much Catholic art such bad art? Is it there's some sense that it because it's portraying or representing an intelligible, theological mystery or truth, that we think it can just be bad art? Or how would you account for why we're awash in bad?
That's the beginning of it. I would just keep pushing your surmise, and I would enlist the help here of Flannery O'Connor, who thought that a lot of the reason that we have bad art in general, and I think this definitely applies to sort of bad Christian, bad Catholic art, is that we're reluctant to get our hands dirty in the particular. Yes, we have a message as Catholics. Yes, we have intelligibility, meaning to spare. And we're dying in our evangelical zeal to share that with the world, and that's a good thing insofar as it goes. But the persuasiveness of a work of art is really only going to work if it delivers on that sensory level. And it has to be persuasive to us on the sensory level. And by sensory level, I mean a whole lot. For example, if it's a work of fiction, the characters, even if they are comic characters or grotesque characters, have to be totally convincing within the rules of the world that is being depicted in the story. And even for that, even in a comic tale like a P.G. Wodehouse, if if the characters don't convince in all of their particularity, then whatever meaning that the artist wants to deliver us, it's going to seem preachy. It's going to seem like it's hitting us over the head. It's going to seem on the nose, as we like to say. So this point may not work again on the supernatural plane, but sort of on the natural level, we need to have some likeness of the sensory human experience that's persuasive. And I think we get, at least sometimes, I think Catholics are getting a lot better at this, but we get too enamored by our message that we lose all that is needed for the craft, whether it's fiction or whatever.
Yeah, maybe we can come back to craft. I want to talk about that too.
I would love that.
At some point, but we can talk about it as a group.
I hate to interrupt, but do you mind taking some questions?
Be happy to. Be happy to. So that'd be great.
Dr. McInerny, thank you. That was very thought-provoking. I was wondering, have you ever read Dietrich von Hildebrand's Ethics?
I have not.
Okay, he makes a distinction, I think it's in the Ethics, between the value and the subjectively satisfying with, I can't remember exactly what it's regard to, but I think in beauty, the value it demands something of us. And that is what is most of all beautiful, and that is why Christ on the cross is the epitome of beauty. But there's not necessarily something bad that is objectively satisfying, but it's not as important as the value that draws us out of ourselves. What would you have to say to that?
I'm sorry, I'm missing it a little bit. So von Hildebrand is saying that the beautiful really comes from a subjective source, or am I misunderstanding?
No, the beauty comes from an objective source.
Okay.
But the truly beautiful, it demands something of you. So like a great symphony, like you were saying with, it demands, it requires all your senses to really engage in it.
Yes.
But you could listen to a pop song to make you feel better right now, and that's subjectively satisfying and not necessarily evil. Does that make sense?
I think I'm getting you. And I think I've read about this distinction of von Hildebrand in other sources, but not directly. I would just contribute this. Every great work of art sits in judgment over us. In what sense? It is giving us, again, if it's a great work of art, not just any work of art, a great work of art is going to give us a kind of standard of what it is to be human. So in Picasso's Guernica, it's saying this is horrific. This is not how human beings should treat one another. That puts us, the audience, under judgment. There's sort of a demand built into the work that we, in a sense, if we're going to acknowledge its greatness, have to submit to, in a way. I'm wondering if that's thinking along the lines of von Hildebrand, but I'm not sure. But thank you. I would love to read it. I can't right now. That's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McInerny. Does art, by necessity, need to have an interpretive aspect to it in order to be considered good art?
What do you mean by an interpretive aspect?
As in the viewer or reader or observer has room to interpret the events of what's going on or what's being shown in a way that isn't necessarily what the creator intended.
Yeah. I talk about this a bit in my book, and it's a question that's a very important question about beauty. In effect, you're asking, is beauty subjective? Is it about what we, the audience, or the appreciator, bring to the work, or is the beauty in the work? It's a big story. I will summarize. The beauty that I was talking about with Dr. Harne earlier is an objective beauty. It's in the artifact. However, it just sits there if someone doesn't come along to appreciate and to think along with it. So art is always a relationship between the work and the person who is encountering it. Another thing to say is that when artists try to capture all the richness of human experience, again, they're capturing something so rich, not even a Shakespeare can get his head around every aspect of the reality that he's depicting. So it's not a surprise that some freshman in high school is going to have an insight into Hamlet that not even Shakespeare had. That doesn't mean that Hamlet is, or the beauty in Hamlet is subjective. It simply means the beauty in Hamlet is such a feast, no one mind can get around it. So I think that's really important to remember. I think students in English classes, when you start tracking down symbolism in stories, it starts feeling like a game that any number can play, right? Anything can be a symbol. Anything can be a symbol of whatever you think it's a symbol of. It's not that easy. But a symbol can have so much reality packed into it that any number of different people will see different things in it. Thank you.
Thank you. Abigail.
Thank you so much for you both being here tonight. I was wondering if you could speak to, Dr. McInerny, in your introduction, you talked about music being one of the most abstract arts.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could, one of you could speak to how it's maybe the most abstract, but also seems to be one of the most innate to the human being.
Oh, yeah. Want to go first with that one?
I couldn't, so it's the most abstract, but also the
And most innate.
most innate. Well, that's very interesting, and I want to hear what you have to say. I think that's probably bound up with speech, the idea that song in speech seems to be innate, and so the idea of song is emerging. Rousseau has some interesting theories about the origin of language. One of the theories about the origin of chant was the reason people chanted the liturgy was because it could be heard in the back. Whereas if you just read it or spoke it, people couldn't hear it. So there's a very kind of a pragmatic explanation for this. But I do think song, you think of mothers singing a lullaby to their children, there's something to be deeply innate. And then the instruments that we tend to appreciate the most are the most voice-like. The violin, for example. So there does seem to be something about that, and also the ways in which some of the most immediately accessible forms of classical music are built around melodic structures that have the periodicity of speech. You can break them down into sentences and phrases. It doesn't. I mean, you can't do that with a Bach fugue, which no one would deny is a great work of art, but it's also not immediately accessible. So I think it's probably bound up with speech. Song.
That's interesting.
Do you have anything?
Now, I take it, Abigail, that your question, when you say music, you're thinking of instrumental music. You're thinking of what philosophers call pure music. You're right. You're not thinking of pop music. You're not thinking of music with lyrics. And you're right to frame it that way, because that's the kind of music that is the most mysterious, perhaps, because it's interesting to note, and I think it's absolutely true, that there is a verbal, even literary metaphor going on in music. It's also obviously nonverbal. And how does it match with what I was saying? I think this is the heart of your question, that all the arts are in some sense trying to picture our quest for happiness. I follow Joseph Pieper in this, another philosopher, Osberger, Roger Scruton, I think, in certain moods, thinks along these lines, that what music is doing is it's trying to picture our interior dynamic, our existential dynamic, how it feels to be a wayfarer struggling for satisfaction in some way. But the thing is, it doesn't do it through literal pictures. It doesn't do it through language. It does it through structured sound. It's very abstract. So I take it that what pure music is trying to capture are the most non-verbal, most implicit elements or dimensions of what it's like to be a human being on the inside. It ends up being a very artificial construct with movements, etc., in some kinds of pieces, but so is a novel a very artificial construct. Jane Austen wrote Pride and Prejudice. It was 3 volumes broken up into chapters. Well, my life doesn't take place in volumes broken up into chapters in any very literal or obvious way. So the artist will always bring a compositional structure, but I think the reality that pure music is trying to capture, again, is that inner existential dynamic. That's a beginning. Great question.
Thank you very much, Dr. McInerny and Dr. Harne. I guess my question is, because it seems like art, what it does is it kind of frames an aspect of reality as an object of contemplation. And my question was, because I believe Joseph Pieper kind of diagnoses our modern age with kind of an inability to truly see the world around us and perceive the fine details and things. I was wondering if you could speak to art as a possible remedy for this, and just kind of the difference in worldview of the artist versus the non-artist, how they look at the world differently.
Wonderful. Want to take that, please? My students here will recall reading with me, maybe in Philosophy 101, maybe 102, a little essay by Pieper's Learning How to See Again. You can read it in about 12 minutes. And he talks about art in that essay as, actually the making of art in that essay as one of the best means for human beings to freshen their perception of the real in the way that you're talking about. I think everything, I mean, you're hitting upon the very soul of art, that why it's important is because of its power to freshen our perception, to see reality in new ways. And not just see it, but because it's attractive, to actually draw us on to conform our lives to the beautiful, which is also the good. So we become new and better beings in a way by appreciating works of art.
I agree with everything you said.
Thank you.
Good evening, Dr. McInerny, Dr. Harne. Dr. McInerny, you said earlier that it's important for the culture to be steeped in good art. When you look at a lot of modern art today, it's not frequently considered to be beautiful. I'm not sure whether you have an opinion on whether it is or not, but how would you say that the modern art movements are affecting our culture today?
Yeah, great question. Your question gives me an occasion to touch on something I didn't in my hors d'oeuvre, and that is, I was presenting one tradition of thinking about art. It wasn't a tradition invented by Aristotle and St. Thomas, but I would say they gave this tradition its clearest articulation. It's a tradition that understands art as mimesis, an imitation of the real. I was calling it a picturing of the real. But there are other traditions, and I take it that what you have in mind are movements in modern art that sometimes very deliberately, very self-consciously were divorcing themselves from the mimetic tradition. Weren't trying to picture reality anymore. That wasn't the game. The game became a more formal one of playing with structures, playing with forms. The painting on the wall was no longer a window, it was an object. It was just paint on a two-dimensional surface, that's it. So we see a lot of that in modern art. I can go a long way with modern art in various genres. There is a limit, though, when you lose any kind of similitude to life, to human action, to the human quest. Any kind of similitude. When that goes away, you've said goodbye to the mimetic tradition, you've said goodbye to the kind of contemplative delight I was talking about, and the best you have is a delight in, I wouldn't call it art so much, I would call it design. And that might be interesting, but it's a completely different kind of thing. But if you know Picasso's Guernica, that's hardly a naturalistic painting. It's very fanciful, it's very abstract in a way, kind of cartoony in a way as Picasso could be. I would still call such a piece mimetic. It's still hanging on to enough of the mimetic tradition that I can see similitudes to human life. And the title helps me too, Guernica. So I can get a read on what is being depicted there. But some works of art, we can see them in the East Wing of the National Gallery in DC, they're not depicting. It's just color. It's just shape. And you can see similar movements in poetry and literature and probably across the genres. So without getting into other particular works, that's kind of how I survey the landscape in light of your question. Does that help?
Thank you. This is a very fascinating topic to talk about. I was wondering, a question that was brought up earlier about Catholic artists frequently producing substandard art because they don't want to get their hands dirty. I was wondering if there was perhaps something you could say about the sort of danger with scandal that I think a lot of Catholic art would be trying to avoid.
Yeah, thank you. Well, my metaphor of not wanting to get their hands dirty didn't have a moral dimension. It was just an artistic metaphor referring to an artist's really not wanting to learn the craft enough to learn, how do you depict a character in a way that's convincing? How do you craft dialogue in a way that's really captivating, for example? That's what I was thinking of and what I think O'Connor was thinking of in saying, artists don't want to get their hands dirty. But your question is very relevant. We can also think of getting our hands dirty in a moral way. So where are the boundaries of depiction of the real life? Where do we cross, perhaps, say, into the obscene? I don't know if there are rules for this, except, the Supreme Court's rule for pornography. You kind of know it when you see it. But definitely works of art can cross the line into the obscene and the morally objectionable. It's just that we want to distinguish between that and a work of art depicting sin. Because art should, in some sense, it has to, if it's going to depict the human experience, it's got to depict sin. The question is how to do it. How to do it in a way that feeds contemplation and not titillation. That's the distinction that we need to make. And again, we could go deeper in that. I don't think there's a hard set of rules, but there are some rules of thumb that I think artists could develop for that. But obviously, it's a very, very important distinction to make. I think the Greeks, ancient Greeks in their theater gave us a hot tip in that they would have their most horrific acts. They would, in a sense, depict the horrific act, but it would always happen off stage. It doesn't have to happen that way, but it's interesting that they thought that the impact of the horror would be maybe more appropriate, but even more intense if the horrific act happened off stage. But that's the beginning of a large discussion. But thank you.
So I think it's really interesting, to see art as an imitation to, bring intelligibility to the world, to the sensory world, and just make a comment. Do you have any practical tips in how we can apply this theoretical knowledge in how we experience looking at a painting or listening to a symphony, or, you know, also distinguishing between what is actual art and what isn't art. So I guess those are my two questions, like practical tips on how to experience the art and how to distinguish between what is art and what is trying to appear as art but isn't.
Right, that's great. Two enormous questions, great questions. There's more than one way, I think, effectively to approach a work of art. One way is simply to find what you know over time has been considered great and simply go and bask in it without a lot of theory, without a lot of reading beforehand, but just having what I call in class a poetic experience of it. We always think of painting when we talk about art, again because of English, but I'm thinking of the novel or the drama or music or whatever. Just soak it up. But art, as I've been saying, does offer us intelligibility. It's not just about feeling. It's not just about a warm fuzzy in the presence of it. So some reflection, perhaps even some study, some conversation is required. So appreciating art with others and talking about it, maybe reading a good review of a movie after you've seen it, can enhance your appreciation of a work of art. But the whole point of it is not the theory all by itself. It's the experience that you have of the beautiful, that you enter into. That's what you want, no matter how much you've read, no matter how much degrees you have in the field of that work. You want the experience more than anything else. I think your second question was, how do we tell good from bad art? Again, I don't think there are global rules for that. There are different traditions. There, I think you dive into a particular genre, you dive into a particular work, you enjoy it for yourself again, and then you see what people say who have really spent serious time with that work. And you value that judgment. You always have to assess it yourself, but you do have to listen to what a tradition has been saying about that work.
Could I just, as a postscript, I'll just throw in, C.S. Lewis wrote a book, An Experiment in Criticism, and one of the things that he mentions in there is that in a great work of art, you can return to it again and again over many years, and you find new things. You know, we've all experienced this, where we see a film, we've seen it once, we have no desire to ever see it again, or we've read a book, we have no desire to read it again. I mean, Gilson makes this distinction between, you know, reading Descartes. You know, once you've read and digested it, there's no reason to go back and reread it. But then, unless you want to specialize in Cartesian philosophy, but then, whereas a great poem, you go back to it again and again, and you find new things, or a great work of music.
That's real good.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was trying to think through the consequence of beauty being a transcendental. And I just want to see if you agree with this inference that I'm thinking of here. So if beauty is a transcendental, but you also have goodness and you have being. And wherever you have being, you have goodness. Where you have an absence of being that should be there, you have evil. Evil is this absence of being. And then it seems that you should also find beauty where you have being. And where you have the absence of being, you should have an absence of beauty. And if this is true, then I'm wondering about the suburbs and very ugly houses, suburbia, American suburbia, ugly houses, strip malls, which in my opinion are very ugly. And if they are very ugly, if I'm right in that, then is it true that there is actually an absence of being there, and that these suburban wastelands are actually evil? Would that follow? Thank you.
Yes. In my philosophy of culture course, we actually talk about the suburbs, and I think your instinct is right. I think there is something missing. something of the human good is missing. I've lived in the suburbs pretty happily, but I think you still have to recognize that it, in some ways, encourages a very individualistic mode of living. Sometimes communities flourish, sometimes there are neighborhood block parties, but I think most of the time we have no clue who's living in the house next door, what's going on in their lives. Sometimes we don't even know their names. So I do think in modern urban too, but in suburban living, there is a lack there. There is something missing from the human good, and therefore something that we see with our eyes manifestly unbeautiful.
Thank you, Drs. McInerny and Harne. Forgive me if this is a more basic question, but you mentioned that the art has to do with the five senses, the five exterior senses in addition to the interior senses. And you mentioned both the visual and the audio arts. I was wondering, how would the senses of taste, touch, and smell also play into that? So like, would a perfectly made whiskey sour, for instance, be, would you call that art? Or maybe even like walking through a rose garden and smelling the roses.
It's beautiful. St. Thomas says that the senses of sight and hearing are the most cognitive senses, meaning that they aid our reason more than the other senses. So I think if we think about the works of art that I was showing in the slides, or you think of your favorite works of art, you're going to find that your senses of sight and hearing are going to be the ones that are engaged. It's because that work of art is, through those senses, is trying to deliver intelligibility. Taste and smell, not so much. Can anyone think of a work of art, a major work of art? We can talk about whether the culinary art is a work of fine art. Maybe we'd have to. But we don't go to museums to scratch and smell. If we do, the guards are going to take us away.
Thank you, Dr. McInerny and Dr. Harne. My question derives from the Nobel Prize acceptance speech that Solzhenitsyn gave in 1970, and he opened it up by quoting Dostoevsky, "Our beauty will save the world." And then, so I'm wondering what you think of that, but then he went on to say that the role of the artist in the modern world is not just not to participate in the lie, but to vanquish the lie.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Want me to start with that, or you want to?
I'll offer a prelude, which is my understanding is that Stalin, or maybe it was Lenin, in order to carry out the crimes that he carried out to create the new man and the new state, would not allow himself to listen to Beethoven. So he pushed all forms of artistic beauty out of his life and saw that as an impediment to actually being able to carry out his plans.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, I think beauty will save the world, again, because we are so attracted to it. And as St. Bernard said, we seek to conform ourselves to that which we love. It's at least, outside of the power of grace, it's one of the most potent ways for intellectual and moral transformation that we have. And to resist the evil in the world, we need a kind of art that is a force of resistance. I absolutely agree and adhere to that. It has to be a work, though, at the same time that exudes consummate craft, or else we run into the problem we talked about earlier. We become so zealous for the mission that we forget to be artists. And that just can't be, because we won't be convincing. And again, we've talked about so much art that is not convincing. It has to convince on more than just kind of the message level.
And I would just, your question raises so many other questions. I would just add, there is a kind of almost musical or harmonic view of reality in which there are humanly made beautiful things are built in certain proportions, and relationships have a kind of unity, a kind of harmony of parts, and a kind of attractiveness. But that beauty itself reflects other dimensions of reality. The way the soul is tuned to the body, the way the seasons are tuned in nature, the way the planets move through the sky, and even beyond the physical and the natural to the supernatural. So there's a sense in which, depending on what he meant by beauty, it could be both the local and the particular experience of beauty, but that could itself point to the very foundations of reality. And I think that an encounter with that kind of beauty will save the world.
Wonderful.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your discussion and your talk, sir. My question is sort of asking about how do you reconcile good art with bad artists? So how can these bad trees bear some good fruit? And what do we do with art that is somewhat like maliciously tainted, like that painting of Marat, or like those elements of Grapes of Wrath, and like it's the clear communist stuff? Yeah, how do we reconcile that?
Part of the answer, again, comes from St. Thomas. You know, art does not depend on the rectitude of the moral appetite. That is to say, who was it who said, Oscar Wilde, a man's being a poisoner is nothing against his prose. That is, you can write excellent prose and still be a moral reprobate. It's certainly possible. I think that's true to a certain point. I think if we're going to have really great art, the kind of art that we were just talking about in answer to Mrs. Hickson's question, you do need a rectitude of appetite, and you do need a rectitude of vision, right? You need to see the human quest in a particular way, how it can be really successful, how it can be disastrous. That kind of vision, I think, produces the greatest art. That's what we see in Dante and Shakespeare and Jane Austen and others. So that's one part of an answer to your question. I don't think I captured the whole thing. I think there was more there. Go ahead. Or maybe I did. I don't know.
Yeah, but what that answers most of it, but also just malicious elements like inside of art.
Yeah, well, again, this came up earlier. I mean, that certainly occurs, and there's some knotty problems that arise, especially if you have a work that has some great merit to it, but then some elements of it are objectionable. Shakespeare can get pretty bawdy, so we ask, where is the point where we say that's too much? We don't seem to say that Shakespeare crosses the line, even though we might have wished, he wouldn't have pushed that joke quite so far. But then other works of art will go over the line. There's no doubt about it, and there are hard distinctions to be made. I think there we just have to get down to cases. Thank you, Nico.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. McInerny and Dr. Harne, for fabulous discussion. Too bad we can't go all evening. And this, you started to address this, just something I'm interested in. I don't have a set. I think it's a difficult one. Just wondering if you have any quick thought. I'm going to go back to the suburbs for a moment, because it just brings up this interesting aspect of a connection between the kind of aesthetic beauty and the possibility of could you have something that actually is beautiful to be seen, but then has a deeper ugliness. So in Professor Hannigan's question there, they kind of blended together, and the reasonable assumption was normally the suburbs are ugly both visibly, and you very reasonably went to that kind of goes along with the kind of deeper ugliness of how people live. But there is a possibility of a kind of beauty in a suburb that still has perhaps that deeper ugliness.
Yeah.
And which raises this whole interesting thing that perhaps Plato was concerned about, of you can have people that are able to make something that is very pleasing on the kind of sense level, but is underneath is maybe conveying that bad meaning or doesn't have a sense of the true journey. And so maybe this is where we encourage Christendom students to become artists. But do you just have any comment on that interesting interplay and the problem of a possible disconnect between something that might be great art in some sense, but then has this problem of how it actually maps on to the truth of the human quest?
Yeah, yeah. Do you want to go, George?
Yeah, I'm thinking I've actually lived in a suburb that was aesthetically beautiful, but it took an hour and 15 minutes to drive from my home to work. And so it became a situation in which I felt like I was living in a hotel. Because I was always in the car. So it was nice when I got there, but it undermined in some ways the foundation for the thriving of family life, because the commute was so long, and it warped the basic structures of time and human interaction in a family. But it was a lovely little neighborhood. It had nice trees and sidewalks, and there was a disconnect. And I also think of the way art has been used. You could make the case that they made this case in the Soviet Union, that all this abstract art was garbage, and we should need to have realistic art. But that realistic art was in the service of the Soviet state. So things are a lot more complicated in those regards. And I think you're right to be suspicious. Sometimes the immediately accessible art that is beautiful immediately is actually a cliche. And we have to seek out art that's more challenging. So I think there are multiple ways in which these things can contradict one another.
Yeah, that's great. I keep thinking of, where'd John go? I keep thinking of Jane Austen in thinking about your question, because throughout her tales you see two sorts of seductions taking place. You see the seduction of physical beauty. It's real physical beauty, but it's masking a moral ugliness. It's deceptive. And then I'm thinking of her novel Northanger Abbey, which I'm actually teaching this semester, where even art itself, the novel itself, becomes a source of seduction. And it's really attractive in ways, but it's really morally dangerous. And so we do have to be attuned to that when it comes to work of art. I was talking about art at the beginning in very general ways, not making any kinds of distinctions between the kind of art that can really seduce and be deceptive in our lives, because on the sensory level, and maybe even beyond a little bit, there's something there that's really attractive, but it's taking us into a moral world that's quite dangerous.
We're going to take two more questions, one from a student and one from Dr. Daly.
Thank you, Dr. McInerny and Dr. Harne, for this very enlightening talk. I just wanted to ask about, I guess, more practically, many of us are not going to produce a work of great art, but is there a
Never
way...
say never.
Is there a way in which we can help, encourage great art? And then I guess tangentially, what is the place for simpler, perhaps less perfect, homegrown art in our culture?
Yeah, great question. Well, we live in a culture that's really an anti-culture, and the sort of the legacy media that produces our mainstream art is corrupt in many ways. So I think your instinct to find ways to resist and counteract that is a good one. And we have to encourage those efforts, however small they may be. And they will be small at the beginning. We have to nurture those like a young plant and really support it so that it grows in an environment that is designed to subvert it. So we want to support young artists. We want to support local artists. We want to support independent artists. And we do want to support those people who want to climb the walls and the citadel of mainstream media and maybe see if some good can still be done there. Okay, we can support that too. But what we can't do is be complacent and just expect television networks and movie studios and publishing houses, et cetera, to give us the artistic nourishment that we need. If it happens, it's almost by mistake rather than by design. End of sermon.
Yeah, I would say don't be afraid to jump in and co-create. I mean,
Yes.
if insofar as, I think it varies from person to person, but insofar as we're made in the image and likeness of God, I think that impulse to create is within us. And that can take the form of very modest means. I think that where you get into trouble is when you make something modest, then proclaiming it to be great,
Yes.
pretending as if it's great. I knew someone who loved to make aquariums, and in a way he was making a world. There were the fish, but there were the plants, and there were all these elements that had to be right for the fish to survive. And it wasn't art, strictly speaking, but it was a kind of co-creation. Mm-hmm. Don't be afraid to write a sonnet. Don't be afraid to write a song. I mean, there are ways to move into the creative act that they don't have high bars for entry. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean it's going to be great, but you've got to start somewhere. So I think if you've got that, but also find good models to imitate. And don't be afraid to submit yourself to a teacher and to the craft. Mm-hmm. That's one of the biggest obstacles is people aren't willing to submit themselves to the years it can take to learn how to write good poetry or to write good music. But yeah, don't be afraid to do it.
Listen to him. That's a beautiful answer.
Your last question will be from Dr. Daly.
Thank you very much. I have a math question for you. No. If you spend much time talking to mathematicians about mathematics, they'll often end up talking about the beauty of mathematics.
Yes.
And there was one who said that the most beautiful proofs of the most beautiful theorems are on a book on God's lap in heaven. So in other words, close to the heart of reality. And it was also said that the beauty of mathematics is what leads mathematicians to assert the reality and the truth of it. So I guess my question is, what is it about the beauty of a thing that leads us to feel like we're really close to the heart of the matter, or that somehow that is drawing us toward something true and real in that sense?
Right. Great question. I mean, art isn't the only thing, obviously, that offers us some truth, that offers us reality. But you're right, we feel in the presence of a great work of art that we are being drawn into the real heart of the matter, the real secret of the mystery of human existence. A work of philosophy can do that too, but it's frankly not, I never said this, it's frankly not as captivating because it's not addressing our senses and our appetites in the way that a work of art will. But a good proof in mathematics, a good scientific theory, Einstein talked about beauty all the time, can give us, if we can give it enough time and patience to appreciate it, can give us that experience of beauty as well. It's not exclusive to art. It's just a little easier with art because of the sense dimension, and I think in particular the story dimension in art.
Yeah, I'll try to answer just very briefly. I've been reading a lot recently about Pythagoreanism and sort of the harmonic theory in the Greeks for some other things I'm working on, and this idea that the most pleasing intervals, the octave, the fifth, the fourth, the octave plus the fifth, the double octave. They discovered pretty early on that there are certain numerical relationships at the root of these. And so they tried to come up with rules and say, well, if multiple ratios are going to yield consonances and of the highest beauty. And Super particular ratios are going to yield secondary, types of beauty, but it didn't line up perfectly. And so they were never, and neither have we, been able to find the perfect alignment between certain kinds of mathematical relations and those that we find to be sonically the most pleasing. Or my guess is the same would obtain within the visual as well. But we know at some level that they're related. And so there is this space for mystery about how these things are related. I think they're good clues, but they're not complete solutions. And so I think the scientists and the mathematicians are onto something. And the musicians and the artists are working at it from the other angle. But I think the room for mystery in there, for inspiration, for divine grace, that seems to be an element in there as well. So.
Wonderful.
Okay, I think those answers deserve a round of applause for Dr. McInerny and Dr. Harne.
Thank you very much.